Harold Finch lived in a world of fading memories. Every morning, he awoke to the sound of silence in a house too large for one man. At 72, his days were shaped by a rigid routine. Breakfast at 7, a slow walk to the library at 10, and an evening spent on his creaking porch, staring into the vast expanse of the night sky. The stars, he thought, were his last true companions. His life hadn't always been this way. There was a time when the house echoed with laughter. His late wife, Margaret, humming while tending her roses, their children running through the halls. But those days were distant. Margaret had passed a decade ago, and his children had moved far away, caught up in lives too busy for their father. Sitting on his porch one evening, Harold sighed and adjusted the thick quilt over his knees. The chill in the air mirrored the emptiness in his chest. He raised his eyes to the heavens, searching the stars for answers he knew wouldn't come. He whispered to himself, "It's just me now. Just me and the universe." The universe, it seemed, was listening. A sudden flash of light streaked across the sky, unlike any shooting star Harold had ever seen. It blazed green and gold, leaving a shimmering trail that lingered unnaturally long. Harold leaned forward, his heart quickening, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. The light seemed to veer, not falling like a meteor but gliding with intent, disappearing into the woods behind his property. For a moment, Harold sat frozen, clutching the quilt as his mind wrestled with what he'd seen. Logic told him it was nothing more than a celestial anomaly. But something deeper, a primal curiosity, urged him to investigate. He shuffled inside, grabbing his flashlight and an old coat. The air grew colder as he approached the edge of the woods, the beam of light from his flashlight cutting through the dark. The woods were eerily silent, save for the crunch of dry leaves underfoot. As Harold pushed deeper into the trees, he felt a strange pull, like an unseen force guiding him. Then he saw it, a faint glow, pulsating softly like a heartbeat. He quickened his pace, and there, in a clearing, his breath caught. A metallic object, no larger than a car, lay nestled in the brush. It shimmered under the moonlight, its surface smooth and unmarred despite its apparent crash. And next to it, slumped against a tree, was a figure. Harold stepped closer, his flashlight trembling in his hands. The figure moved, a woman or something resembling one. Her skin glimmered faintly, her eyes half open and filled with something he couldn't place. Fear? Exhaustion? Or maybe desperation. "Please," she whispered, her voice like music. "Help me." Harold's world, so small and predictable, cracked wide open. Whatever he chose to do next, life would never be the same. Harold's mind screamed to turn back, but his feet betrayed him, drawing him closer to the woman. If that's what she was. Her form flickered faintly, as if struggling to hold shape, her silver-toned skin radiating a soft, unearthly glow. She looked human, but there was something otherworldly in her impossibly symmetrical features and the faint luminescence tracing her veins. "Are you hurt?" Harold stammered, his voice cracking from years of disuse. Her gaze met his, and he felt an inexplicable warmth, like sunlight cutting through a cold morning. She nodded weakly, her hand trembling as she reached toward him. "Help me," she whispered again, her voice trembling, each word like a note in a song. Harold knelt beside her, his flashlight casting eerie shadows on the metallic object behind her. The craft, if it could be called that, seemed to hum faintly, its surface smooth and devoid of seams. But his focus remained on her. He hesitated before gently placing a hand on her arm, expecting coldness but feeling a surprising warmth. I'll help you," he said, the words surprising even himself. He hadn't cared for another soul in years, yet there was no hesitation in his resolve. "Danger," she murmured, her voice fainter now. "They follow." Harold's pulse quickened. He glanced nervously at the surrounding woods, but they remained still and silent. "Who's following you?" She didn't answer, her eyes fluttering shut as her head slumped forward. Panic shot through him. Whoever or whatever she was running from could still be out there. With a grunt, Harold shifted his weight and lifted her into his arms. She was surprisingly light, as if her body was only partially bound to this world. The faint glow of her skin dimmed, and her breathing slowed, her fragile state urging him to move quickly. He stumbled back toward his house, the trees closing in around him like silent sentinels. Every rustle of leaves sent his heart racing, but he pressed on, focusing on the faint rise and fall of her chest. Once inside, he laid her gently on the worn couch in his living room, her form almost blending into the faint light of the room. He fumbled with an old first aid kit, though he doubted anything inside would be of use. As he searched for something, anything, to help her, the woman stirred, her eyes fluttering open, her gaze fixed on him, and for a moment, she seemed to study his face as if trying to memorize it. "You are kind," she whispered. Harold froze, feeling a strange lump in his throat. He hadn't heard those words in years, and they struck a chord deep within him. Before he could respond, her body tensed, and her eyes widened with sudden urgency. "They're here," she said, her voice sharp. Harold turned to the window, his heart pounding as he saw faint lights flickering through the trees. The tranquility of his world was shattered. Whatever was coming, it was already too late to turn back. The lights outside grew brighter, weaving through the trees like predators searching for prey. Harold pulled the curtains shut, his hands shaking as he turned to the woman on his couch. Her breathing had steadied, but her eyes were alert now, glowing faintly in the dim room. "What do they want?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Me," she replied simply, her gaze heavy with exhaustion. "I escaped, but they won't stop." Her words hung in the air, chilling and final. Harold felt a surge of protectiveness that defied reason. He had spent years hiding from the world, but now, with danger knocking at his door, he felt more alive than he had in decades. "You're safe here," he said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Her lips curved into a faint smile, tinged with sadness. "You don't know what you're risking, old man. I know what it feels like to have nowhere to turn," he replied, surprising himself with the strength in his voice. "You're staying?" She studied him for a moment, her glowing eyes searching his face as though trying to understand him. "Why would you help a stranger? You owe me nothing." Harold hesitated. He didn't have an answer that made sense. "Maybe I'm tired of doing nothing," he said finally. "Maybe I owe myself that much." The silence between them thickened, broken only by the faint hum of the craft still nestled in the woods. He sat down across from her, the glow of her skin illuminating the lines of his face. "Do you have a name?" he asked softly. She hesitated, as if sifting through memories. "Lyra," she said finally. "My name is Lyra." "Harold," he replied, offering a faint smile. Her lips twitched, almost in amusement. "Thank you, Harold." The sound of her voice saying his name sent a shiver down his spine. It had been years since anyone had spoken to him with such tenderness. As the minutes passed, Lyra's posture softened, and she began to tell him fragments of her story. Her voice was melodic yet heavy with sorrow. She had been a scientist, tasked with discovering worlds to save her dying people. But her work had made her a target of those who sought power, forcing her to flee. "They see me as a threat," she said. "I only wanted to save my people, but now I'm hunted." Harold listened, enraptured by the vulnerability in her words. She was unlike anyone or anything he'd ever known. Her strength and fragility intertwined, a contradiction that drew him closer. As she spoke, their gazes met, and something passed between them. It was fleeting but undeniable, a connection forged in shared loneliness. "I don't know what I can do to help," Harold admitted, "but I'll try." Before Lyra could respond, the lights outside the window intensified, casting the room in an eerie glow. She tensed, gripping his hand. "They found me," she whispered, and for the first time in years, Harold felt a spark of purpose. The hum of the lights outside intensified, piercing the fragile silence of the house. Harold tightened his grip on Lyra's hand, his pulse racing. "What do we do?" he whispered. She rose slowly, her movements graceful but deliberate, as if every step cost her strength. "They won't stop until they have me," she said, her voice steady but tinged with regret. If I stay, you'll be in danger. Harold shook his head. I'm not letting them take you. There has to be another way. Lyra turned to face him, her luminous eyes filled with something he couldn't quite name. Gratitude, sorrow, perhaps even affection. You've already done more for me than I ever deserved, she said softly. But this isn't your fight. It is now, Harold said, his voice firm. Her gaze softened, and she reached up, placing her hand lightly on his cheek. Her touch was warm, soothing, and it made his chest ache with an emotion he couldn't quite define. Harold, she murmured, you've reminded me of something I thought I'd lost. Kindness. You've given me hope when I had none. He opened his mouth to argue, to beg her to stay, but she cut him off with a sad smile. I have to go. If I don't, they'll destroy everything. The weight of her words pressed down on him, and he knew she was right. But the thought of her leaving, of the quiet returning to his life, felt unbearable. Then I'll go with you, he said desperately. Lyra's smile widened, and for a moment, it seemed as though she might agree. But then her expression grew serious. You don't belong in my world, Harold. It would destroy you. A sudden noise outside shattered their moment. Voices, mechanical sounds, the crunch of footsteps. Lyra turned sharply, her body tensing. They're here. Panic surged through Harold. There has to be something I can do, he pleaded. Lyra glanced toward the window, then back at him. There is, she said. She stepped closer, her glowing form seeming to brighten as she placed both hands on his shoulders. Remember me. Remember what you've done tonight. That's all I ask. Her words struck him like a blow. That's not enough, he said, his voice breaking. It has to be, she replied, her own voice thick with emotion. Before he could respond, Lyra stepped back, her glow intensifying until it filled the room. Harold shielded his eyes as a blinding light enveloped her. When it faded, she was gone. He staggered to the window, his heart pounding. Outside, the lights were retreating, dissolving into the darkness of the woods. The house fell silent once more, but it felt different now. Emptier, colder. Harold sank into his chair, staring at the spot where Lyra had stood. He whispered her name into the silence, the sound of it filling the void she had left behind. As he looked up at the night sky, the stars seemed brighter, as if she was still out there watching. For the first time in years, Harold felt truly alive. Even his tears traced silent paths down his face.